So I was planning to do a talk on Raja Yoga, and instead you're going to get a talk on faith. So I have the faith that this is what you're supposed to hear tonight and what I'm supposed to talk about. Faith is a big, big, big topic. A big topic. Very personal, very intimate. Priyananda mentioned about the Lotus Prayer Book. Yes, I had the great privilege of working on that project, and it was totally the product of faith. I was sent to California. I was in Santa Barbara, and I figured, what am I going to do here? And I remembered Gurudev speaking about this book, and I said, well, I could put together this book. The only trouble was I didn't have a computer. Within a day or two of my just inwardly stating that intention without telling it to anyone, someone from the community showed up at my doorstep with a new Apple computer, still boxed. And they said, I think you might have use for this. And I said, as a matter of fact, I do, but it's not even open. You haven't used it. And they said, it's okay. Somehow I feel you're supposed to have it. So I started working on the book. A year later, I was transferred to the San Francisco Integral Yoga Institute. The book was still in process, and they had an institute computer, but that was always used for institute business. So I wanted to continue, but I didn't have a computer. Within a couple of days, someone shows up at the institute with an unopened box, the same exact computer, because I didn't even have to go through a learning curve there. And he said, I heard you working on a book. Why don't you use this computer? And I said, but you haven't even opened it yet. It's new. It doesn't matter. I think what you're doing is more important. Use it. When you're through, I can have the computer back. So I worked as hard and fast as I could. And literally, at night, I would go to sleep saying something like, I need a Shinto prayer on power. The next morning, outside my door would be a book with a marker in it, and inside would be a Shinto prayer on power. It was that obvious that some other force was behind this. So I contracted with a printing company in the Midwest. They told me when they would need my copy in order to have it ready in time for the Grand Lotus celebration in July 1986. I couldn't complete it on time. In fact, I was about a month late. And I sent it to them, and I said, you know, we're having the opening of a very special temple. I know I'm late. I know it's my fault, but can you please have it ready on time? And they said, absolutely not. I'm sorry, it's physically impossible. We have all these jobs in a queue. We cannot do it. And that poor man, I said to him, I totally understand, but I think it's supposed to be there. And somehow I have the faith that it is. So he hung up the phone. Within a week, he called me back, and he said, lady, this is what I can do for you. I can print 10 pages, put them on a board. You could display it at your event. And I said, that's so kind of you, sir, but somehow I have the faith that the book is actually going to be there. And again, he said, madam, it is impossible. I said, I understand, but I have the faith. He hung up the phone. A few days later, he called me again. He said, madam, This is what I can do. I can print you 25 copies, but I can't give you the good way of binding. That would take too long. So I can give you simple binding, 25 copies. And I said, you're so kind. But still, I really think the book is supposed to be there, and I have faith it's going to make it. A week later, he called me and he said, what is the absolute latest you can receive it? What is the location of the event? Give me the address, and I will ship it there by train. So I gave him the information. Those of you who were there then remember it began Friday morning with a huge interfaith panel of dignitaries in Charlottesville. It began at 9. At 8:15, the train arrived. Someone was there, picked up the carton, brought it back to the hall. Gurudev was in a special room meeting with all the dignitaries. They cracked the box open, and he gave one to each of them as a gift. And that's how the Lotus celebration began. I drove that poor man crazy. He couldn't withstand the power of faith and God's plan. God's plan. The thing is, when we walk with faith, we are never alone. We know, we trust that there's a higher power always with us, supporting, protecting, guiding us. Faith is about relationship. We connect. We connect with this power that's everywhere, but it is invisible. It's all powerful, but it's intangible. It's the essence of consciousness, but it's beyond the comprehension of our minds. It's mystery upon mystery. Faith is a bridge. It's a portal to the unknown, to the hidden mystery and workings of the universe. People sometimes ask the question and ponder, does God exist? I think this is a very boring question. Frankly, I don't care if God exists. If that God is simply off somewhere in some corner of the universe ordering the movement of the spheres. I'm not really interested in a God of that nature. The question that is important to me is, does God care? And more particularly, does God care about me? And when I say me, I mean each and every one of us and all life on the planet. And the answer I have gotten repeatedly in my life is yes. There is this power, this presence, this consciousness that hears our prayers, that responds, that works through everyone and everything, if we have the eyes to see, the ears to hear, and the heart to receive. Many years ago, when we used to have snow, late one afternoon, I decided to take a walk through the woods. It wasn't a big snowfall, but enough to sort of obscure the path, but I figured, shouldn't be difficult to navigate. I didn't tell anyone I was going out or that I was going on a path through the woods, and I miscalculated. Dusk descended much more quickly than I had anticipated. And not only that, the temperature began to rapidly drop. Those of you who know me know that geography isn't my strong suit to begin with, But here I was in an ever-darkening forest, the path obscured by snow. And within a very short amount of time, I was totally disoriented. I didn't know which way to go. It was like being in a mist, you know, where you're in a fog, especially if you're out on one of those rocky points in the ocean, and the mist comes in, and you're not sure which way's out and which way is back to shore. It was sort of like that feeling. So at that moment, I looked up, because we say God is everywhere, but somehow when we want to have a conversation, we don't look over our shoulder, we don't look down, we always look up. So I looked up and said, Lord, I am lost. I don't know where to go. No one knows I'm out here, and it looks like I might die this evening alone in the woods of hypothermia. I never thought it would come to an end like this, but I think this may be it. The moment after I uttered that prayer, literally from out of nowhere, this very large white dog came from my left-hand side, walked up, stood right in front of me, gazed at me for a moment, and took off. And I had a moment to think, and I thought, well, I don't know where to go. He seems to know where to go, so what's there to lose? And I just went after that dog. And two things I will say. If the color of the dog hadn't been white, I wouldn't have been able to see him in order to follow him. And secondly, if he had gone any quicker, I couldn't have kept up. So we're wending our way through the woods for about 15 minutes, and he is way ahead of me now. So finally, I'm trying to follow the trail he set, and I emerge from the woods. And there he is, standing at the head of the path, looking, waiting for me to come out. And not only did he lead me out of the woods, but do you know where we came out? At the back of the monastery. He brought me home. So I stood there looking at this dog that I had never seen before. I bowed, I thanked him. He looked at me, and then he turned and went, and I never saw him again. So what was this? Synchronicity, he just happened to be there. Serendipity, a stroke of good luck, or divine intervention? Guess what I think? Divine intervention. When difficulties come in life, we can pause, take a breath, and decide to trust in God's mercy and grace rather than getting discouraged or disheartened by our own limitations. There's a story in the Jewish tradition about the founder of the Hasidic movement, who was known as the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the holy name. It is said when misfortune was about to come upon the people, he would go to a special place in the forest. He would light a sacred fire, and he would recite a holy prayer. And the crisis was averted. After he passed on, there was a successor. And in time, another crisis occurred. So this rabbi would go to the place in the forest, but he didn't know how to light the fire. But he remembered the prayer, and he said, Lord, this has to be sufficient because we need your help. And it was. After him came another rabbi, and yet another crisis. So this rabbi knew the place in the forest, but he didn't know how to light the fire, nor did he know the prayer. But he looked to the Lord and said, this must be sufficient. we need your help. And it was. And finally came the last rabbi in that chain. He didn't know the place in the forest. He didn't know how to light the fire. He didn't know the prayer. And when the crisis came, he simply went into his living room, sat in a chair, and said, Lord, all I can do is tell you the story. But we really need your help. So even that needs to be sufficient. And it was. Such is the grace of the divine. I think for some people, faith comes naturally as a default setting as they move through life. The benefit of this approach is that it provides a way to keep our peace no matter what is happening. But I think most of us vacillate between faith and fear, trust and anxiety, acceptance and resistance. Does that sound more familiar for most of us? When times of crisis come, we see the depth, the consistency, and the limitations of our faith. But I would say, even if faith doesn't come naturally to us, even if we see all its failings or limitations, we always have at our disposal the ability and the option to choose faith. Embrace faith as an act of will if it isn't a natural inclination of the heart. And when you try to see through the lens of faith, it's like what you seek, you find. If you're looking to buy a new car, and let's say you want to buy a blue Prius, somehow, when you go out and about town, you always seem to see a blue Prius because your radar is set to that frequency. You know what I'm saying? If you're looking for that divine companionship and you inwardly set yourself to that channel, you will eventually experience it. I say about Brother Lawrence, who's famous for practicing the presence of God. It began by him imagining and visualizing that God in the form of Jesus was with him all the time. But it evolved until he reached the point where that living presence was with him all the time. Isn't there a verse in the Bible? Seek and ye shall find. So, if we look with that vision, we will see it in the everyday and unexpected circumstances of our life. Once, many years ago, I was planning a teaching tour. There were many stops. There was a complicated itinerary. I had made all the calls. I had booked all the legs of the journey. I was confirming with all my hosts that it would work for them. And so much to do, and I got down to the finish line where there was only very little time left to confirm the booking, or I would lose the whole routing and the great price I had gotten. So the booking would be canceled at midnight. Somehow I didn't get on the phone until 10:30 that night, but I figured more than enough time. Yeah. Somehow delays, all that music playing all the time. I couldn't get a connection. It's like 11:20 now. I finally get an agent but the agent seemed to be having difficulty understanding what I was saying. The pressure was building inside me. The impatience was starting to come out of my mouth. And literally, we got down to the absolute last minute, and it was booked. As soon as it was booked, this man on the other end, who is giving me so much difficulty, said to me, "Swami, would you pray for me, please?" I went, oh my goodness. First of all, most people think Swami is like your first name, you know, and so he knew that it meant I was a monk. And all of a sudden it was like I woke up. Had I lost my mind? All this anxiety, pressure. I wasn't very nice on the phone. And I said, "I certainly will, sir. I certainly will." And I hung up the phone, and silently I proceeded to offer 3 Triambakam mantras on his behalf. As soon as I completed these 3 rounds of silently saying Triambakam mantra, I hear his voice again. And he says, "Thank you, Swami," like that. "Thank you, Swami." And he hung up the phone. It was a new phone, and I pushed the wrong button to disconnect it. I thought it was disconnected, but he was still on the line, but I was silently repeating. So, who was he? Was he just a random travel agent? Or was he divinely placed there to teach me a lesson? I think the latter. If we have the eyes to see, the ears to hear, the heart to receive, the universe, you can say the divine, the cosmic consciousness, whatever you perceive it to be, is always communicating with us. One more short story in that regard. Years passed. I injured my knee very badly. I wanted to heal it naturally. I tried for 5 years because I was concerned that the intervention would make it worse. Nothing worked. So I was on a trip home from Florida to the ashram, and I was wondering, should I go ahead with the surgery? Should I not? What should I do? And I spoke to my friend who was with me, and I said, I don't know what to do. Should I have the surgery or not? The moment after I said that, this huge van pulled right in front of our car, and on the back was a huge bumper sticker that said, "God answers knee mail." So how did I interpret it? It's sort of a play on email, and it's also a play on prayer, because you're kneeling. So I looked at my friends and I said, well, I guess I got my answer. I went home, booked the procedure, and it all went well. So, a few things about what faith is and what faith isn't. Faith is about living in the present moment, neither dwelling in the past nor worrying about the future, trusting that everything that we will need will be provided at the perfect time. There's a French mystic by the name Caussade who lived in the 18th century. He's an interesting fellow because he combines in his teaching Christian devotion with a sort of Zen being present in the moment. And he used to say, the higher power is always communicating itself to us through all the big and small events of our lives. In fact, God is masquerading through all the people that we come in contact with. In the duty of the moment, the divine will for us and all that we need is given. Again, if that's where our radar is tuned. Faith is not about being impractical or shirking responsibility. You can't say, well, I don't have to do anything, God will take care of it. Doesn't work that way. Doesn't work that way. Sometimes people want to negotiate. I think it's in the Quran, there's a verse, if you take one step toward God, God will run 10 steps toward you. So people negotiate. Well, I don't need God to run 10 steps to me. 9 will be fine. I'll just skip my 1. It doesn't work that way. You're taking the one, initiates the whole process. Gurudev used to say, Gurudev Swami Satchidananda, do your best and leave the rest. After you've done your best, accept the outcome. In that regard, there was an Islamic saint, a very fiery woman by the name Rabia. And she once had a terrible illness. And one of her friends came to her and said, Rabia, God will certainly answer your prayers. Pray to God to take this illness from you. And she looked at her friend and said, what are you talking about? Who do you think gave me this illness? It is not good, she said, to oppose one's beloved. So faith is not about being impractical. Faith is also not about having a Pollyanna attitude. There are times when our minds are outraged and our hearts are overcome. But girded with faith, we don't succumb to anger or despair. We find courage to face the unthinkable and strength to shoulder the unbearable. Give you one little more story about a Zen monk. I'm giving you an interfaith smorgasbord here. A Zen monk and a samurai warrior. Our monk was meditating in the forest one day when suddenly this big, aggressive-looking samurai came upon him and demanded, monk, teach me the difference between heaven and hell. And the little monk looked up at him and looked down and said, I can't teach you anything. Look at you. You're dirty. You're unkempt. You're crude. Even your sword is stained and rusty. He hit a nerve when he mentioned the sword, and the samurai swung it overhead and was about to bring it down on the little monk. And in that moment, the monk gently said, that, my friend, is hell. And the samurai was taken aback and thought, oh my goodness, this monk risked his life to give me this lesson. He placed his sword back in its sheath, and his heart was filled with compassion. And the little monk looked at him and said, friend, and that is heaven. That's what, if we're rooted in that inner connection, we can face anything. In the Bible, we are told, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you shall say to the mountain, come hither, and it will come, and nothing will be impossible to you. Probably he used that example because the mustard seed was the smallest thing around. He didn't say you need a basket full of faith or a cart full of faith, the tiniest amount. A saintly woman once said, we don't need great faith. All we need is faith in a great God. And I would say that faith, too, is something we need in ourselves, not only in some higher power or overarching consciousness and force in the universe, but in ourselves, because that presence lies within us as well. I once asked Swami Satchidananda why people don't go deep in their practice, and his answer was simple. He said, they don't go deep because they don't have conviction. They don't believe they can. So if you haven't gone deep, that was his words at the time. We don't believe it. I think in spiritual life, sometimes low self-esteem masquerades as humility. Humility doesn't mean to think little of yourself. True humility means you realize your limitations, but you realize that there is this higher power that can back all your good efforts. And the last point about faith, when you are trying to cultivate faith, tests will come. Faith is like a muscle. It needs to be exercised in order to grow stronger. In fact, there's an axiom in spiritual life. The more you trust God, the more you are tested. Trust and test go together. One of my favorite quotes from Mother Teresa was, God never gives us more than we can handle. Sometimes I just wish he didn't trust me so much. Imagine if she felt that way. And her namesake, St. Teresa of Avila, there's a story about her when she got a divine command to travel to the other side of Spain and open a new convent. She was ready to go the next day when one of the sisters stopped her and said, "Where are you going, Teresa?" "I'm going to the other side of Spain. The Lord came and told me to start a new convent there." And the sister asked her, "Well, what provisions are you taking with you? Do you have any money? I mean, this is going to cost to travel, get accommodations, purchase a building, outfit the building, and then travel back. Are you prepared?" So Teresa put her hand in her pocket and pulled out the equivalent of $5. And she said, "This is what I have." And the sister looked at her and said, "Are you kidding? How are you going to accomplish all that with just $5? And as the story goes, Teresa thought about it a moment, and then she replied, "You are correct. Teresa and $5 can accomplish nothing. But God, Teresa, and $5 can accomplish everything." And she went, and it was done. In conclusion, the universe is an infinite field of possibilities. Faith enables us to experience the best possible outcomes and to retain our faith and our peace no matter what unfolds. There's a great poet from India by the name Rabindranath Tagore, and I love his definition of faith. He says, "Faith is the bird that feels the light and sings while the dawn is still dark." So I would say, if a little bird can have that much of faith, we too can choose to embrace faith. And no matter what the circumstances in our own lives or in the world around us, we can look forward to a bright dawn ahead. Om Shanti.